I don't know what you thought of that line, faith can sing through days of sorrow. As I mentioned, this is a season of poppies, and according to the British Legion, a humble, poignant symbol of remembrance and hope. And we see poppies everywhere, and people are wearing them, and sometimes different coloured poppies. During the First World War, much of Western Europe's countryside was blasted and bombed and fought over time after time. And previously beautiful landscapes turned to mud, to bleak and barren scenes where little or nothing could grow. And yet, as a striking and notable exception, resilient poppies flourished in their thousands amid chaos and destruction. And it wasn't the first time that this had been noticed. There were 100 years previously, in the Napoleonic Wars, there were reports of poppies growing where the bodies lay, where people had died, and some perhaps the bodies left, others buried where they fell, but poppies. And in fact, I've even heard a report, perhaps that right way back in time of Genghis Khan, there were this thing about poppies. These remarkable plants prefer habitats in full sun, and they will thrive in poor soil. Generally speaking, however, sowing into lawns or existing grassy areas, I'm talking here of the corn poppy, not the opium poppy, I'm not so sure about that one, but the corn poppy, which is the Flanders poppy, sown into lawns or existing grassy areas, generally speaking, doesn't bring much success. The ground must be disturbed and turned over. And the remarkable thing about the poppy seeds is that they can lie undisturbed without water for decades and retain all their potency. They lie there waiting, dormant in the soil, looking, as it were, for an appropriate opportunity. And then when it comes, they can in one season spring up and flower and set seed, and all before the grasses and the other weeds begin to take over again. And so it was in the battlefield, and particularly in the battlefields of the Western Front, that they blossomed in profusion, blossomed on the edge of the trenches as poems of picking the poppies that grew on the edge of the trenches. They blossomed in land cultivated not by the plough, but on soil laid bare by explosions and mortars and mines. And so the poppy, quite appropriately, is a symbol of remembrance, but also hope. Faith and unbelief, the joy and sorrow make strange bedfellows. There, for a number of years, was a chaplain, part-time chaplain in mental health, and there's a lady I remember regularly visiting in Cambuslang. I was in Glasgow, but used to go out to Cambuslang, and I used to ask her how she was, and it was always the same. She said, "Oh, happy and sad, happy and sad." And she was both. She felt the two, and I don't know how that works, but we can. War and conflict can bring out the worst in people, but it can also draw forth the best. In A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens captured something of the juxtaposition of these conflicting sentiments, and he acknowledged both, denying neither. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, and we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, and we were all going the other way. There's a collision. But in the end, war and conflict and suffering are not the final statements upon our humanity. It's not the only lens in which to look out at the world, or the only lens with which to look at God. For some, the memories are too painful to remember. I knew a man in my younger years, he's passed now, and you've heard the story, others say the same, would never speak about why he got his medals from the First World War, never even told his wife. And yet for others, and I've heard the same too, they were the best years of their lives. There's a struggle, there's a conflict and a collision, and we feel that. And there's a struggle and a conflict between faith and the narrative that goes with that, and the narrative of its repudiation. Some found faith and do find faith in times of hardship. Others relinquish it in dismay. And it's appropriate we acknowledge the division these things create, but they do bring a division. I'd like to share briefly a story from the Old Testament of a man, and it's a man called Jacob. And just very, very briefly, a man who Jacob, and it's the story of how Jacob became Israel. Because he was born Jacob, or named Jacob, but yet God gave him another name. And it was his children, the 12 sons that he had, who became the original forefathers of the nation that today calls itself Israel. But Jacob had begun life, and he had valued and treasured a promise that was given to his family, a promise that there would be blessing would come down through the family line. And blessing not just for them, but indeed for the whole world. And Jacob treasured that. His older brother, he's only a little bit older because they were twins, did not treasure it. And Jacob connived and schemed, and to cut a long story short, the blessing and the promise ended up going through him rather than his brother. And his brother, once he realized, hated him for it and wanted to kill him. And Jacob had to flee, and he spent several years after that with an uncle in a distant land. But then, and was there, he prospered, he got married, he had children. But the day came and God told him to go home. It was time to go back. And in so doing, he had to confront the issues of his youth. And he had to confront in that something of himself. And something of the way that he'd responded to God, because there was always a kind of brash confidence that God would provide. And God indeed had provided. But as he came back, his brother was still in the land, and his brother, he then heard a report that his brother was coming to meet him with several hundred men. And he didn't know why. And as you can imagine, he was scared. And he, as was his way, he made his plans, and he divided up the family, and he divided up all his wealth and everything, so that if one was attacked, then the other might hopefully survive. But then he was still, once he'd done it all, it says he was left alone at night. And he had to now confront those tensions and the issues and the struggles that had gone on within him, and the struggles of his past, and his relationship with his brother, and indeed with God. And it says, and it's read the story if you wish. It's in Genesis 32. The reference is on the sheet. But it's a story that has been deeply meaningful to Jewish people over the centuries. They've always wrestled, what does this story mean? Because what happened was, as he was there alone, it says, a man came and wrestled with him all night long. And it was like a pitched struggle, a wrestling match. And later, in the Old Testament, the prophets interpret that it was an angel. The word angel means messenger. It was someone from God. And was this human? Was it divine angel in some way? But the message of this is that God was in this. And it, in this physical, very physical way, that gets us all thinking about how that can be, that he was battling with God. But then as the night wore on and the dawn came, the man who'd come to wrestle with him said, let me go because the dawn is coming. And Jacob now had come to the point where he knew he needed the assurance of God's presence and his blessing. He said, no, I'll not let you go unless you bless me. And the man asked, what's your name? And he answered, Jacob. And the man said, I quote, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you've struggled with God and man and have overcome. Not that he'd won the better of others, or that he'd won a victory over God, but in that struggle, he had overcome in terms of himself. He blessed him there. And Jacob called the place Peniel, which means the face of God. He says, because I saw God face to face, and my life was spared. And the sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping. And he bore ever after the mark of a tussle that had gone on within. War and conflict and suffering are not the final statements upon humanity, nor are they the ultimate lens through which to look at life or each other or matters of faith. But they challenge us, and there's a struggle. And we are called to engage in that struggle, not just for ourselves, for the communities that we're part of, indeed, for the betterment of the world. Because it's as we overcome the internal struggle, we're positioned in a place to take forth what has been won, as it were, in our name, that we may indeed live and walk and be vehicles of hope and life to others.